Chapter 10. My brother did not win the fight with the demon that killed our father. He did not even fight this night, but instead gave himself willingly to the enemy. I fear my brother may not be strong enough to win the fight against the monster who now walks among the people. The morning dawned bright and clear over the reservation outside of Agate, New Mexico. The sky had a faint reddish tint to it that the old-timers said was blood filling the day. This morning they were right, but no one knew it yet. The children had just finished their chores and headed off in groups to play before the heat drove them inside. Those men with jobs were already at work. The farmers and ranchers were tending to their lands. So far, it seemed like another normal day. Down the old highway to the west of the reservation, a dozen small farms clung to the desert like flies to the back of a dead horse. The houses were not much more than faded wood shacks, the yards a patchwork of weeds, old cars, and rusting farm equipment. A new Ford pickup turned into one of the driveways and kicked up a small cloud of dust as it stopped. Dan Bonney climbed out, stuck a cigarette in the side of his mouth, and paused to light it. He took a long puff, felt the nicotine catch and hold, and then he went to the back of the truck. The cigarette was an important part of his work. As much as he loved the job, he hated the stink that surrounded live animals. Dan Bonney was a shearer and wool buyer for 3 firms down in Albuquerque. Part of his territory was the reservations of northern Arizona and New Mexico. Most people assumed he was an athlete, probably a basketball player. He stood well over 6 feet tall and had a graceful athletic build. His arms were corded with muscle, but he got paid for his abilities with sheep, not his abilities on a basketball court. He could shear a sheep in less than a minute, and was known in the area for being fair with his prices. Almost everyone liked him. Dan grabbed a bunch of tools from the bed of the truck and headed around the side of the shack. As he did, the farmer came outside. Robert Nadir was a weathered man in his 50s. Dan had known him for years. Robert's family had lived and worked the surrounding land as sheep herders for 3 generations. He had almost 100 sheep in the hills nearby and was making just enough off their wool and meat to get by. Last night he had brought in 12 to be sheared. "Morning, Dan," Robert said, pulling back his long black hair to get it out of the faint breeze. Beside him, a young boy of 6, his youngest son, stayed near the door, as if afraid. Dan smiled at the kid, but the smile didn't break the fear. Nothing did. That boy had been afraid of Dan from the first time they met, when the kid was still in diapers. Robert's wife had watched the interaction, over 5 years ago now, and said, "It's almost as if he sees death behind you." "Hey, Robert," Dan said, dropping his equipment beside the sheep pen. "You forget how to count?" "No." Robert sounded a bit offended. "I thought you said 12, Dan said. Robert walked up to the sheep pen and peered inside. He frowned as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He quickly checked the gate, but it was latched. "There were 12 here last night." The boy swallowed hard and pressed himself against the door. He was staring at Dan, as if Dan were at fault. Dan suppressed a sigh. He'd seen this happen before. He took a good look at the dirt near the pen. He didn't notice anything unusual, but then tracking wasn't his speciality. Maybe one of the big cats got them. The population of puma in the area had been increasing over the last few years, and the sheep ranchers were feeling the pressure the worst. But the state protected the big cats, and there wasn't a hell of a lot any of the farmers could do about them. Dan shoved his hands into his pockets. The sheep were acting more skittish than usual this morning. They were huddled on the far side of the pen, as if they were trying to hide. That was unusual in and of itself. Sheep deserved their reputation as some of nature's most stupid animals. They didn't have enough of a memory to recognize Dan from his semi-annual visits. "I don't see how a cat could have gotten in," Robert said, moving along the pen between the fence and the house. "I would have heard, and there would be signs that—" He stopped abruptly, head down. Dan glanced at the boy, who was still watching them, eyes wide. The kid gave him the creeps. Dan shook off the feeling and walked over to Robert. Robert was staring at the ground before him. A large pool of blood, some of it still red and fresh, filled the area between the house and the pen. Red and fresh. That meant that whatever had taken the sheep was still here, or newly gone. Had the truck scared the creature off? Most likely. But what kind of cat attacked a ranch in broad daylight? Then Dan heard a splash. The pool of blood rippled. Simultaneously, he and Robert looked up. The blood was dripping from the roof of the shack. But how was that possible? Predators in this part of the country didn't carry their prey upward. They dragged an injured or dead animal to a private spot in the desert and feasted. This behavior was unusual enough to make him very nervous. Dan moved back around the pen and indicated that Robert should step away from the building with him. Robert held out a hand to his son so that the boy wouldn't move. Not that he was going to. The kid looked like he was glued to the shack's front door. When Dan and Robert had both gone a few feet, Dan turned around and saw a sight that chilled him down to his bones. On the roof were the remains of the 2 sheep. From the looks of it, they had been gutted and their heads cut off. Most of the wool was stained red, and one of the sheep looked to be half eaten. "How in the hell did they get up there?" Robert asked. Dan didn't answer. He couldn't. He watched as some unseen force ripped the remaining sheep in half. He couldn't see what had done it, and that made the hair on the back of his neck rise. "Son," Dan said to the young boy standing on the porch, "go fetch your father's rifle." The young boy nodded. His eyes grew wider, if that were possible. Dan was about to issue the order again when a blue flash appeared above the bodies of the sheep on the roof. Like a bolt of lightning, it shot out and struck Robert square in the chest, exploding blood and intestines all over the fence. "What the—" But before Dan could say another word, another bolt struck him, severing his head, as if it had never really been attached. And the little boy watched, frozen in place, as the vision he had seen for as long as he could remember came true.